killed Roberto Escalante.
I never killed anybody in my life.
But while we're here, we gotta protect our turf. People gotta respect us. And you know what people respect? Force.
I've gone 100 miles out of my way to find out what makes these monsters tick.
You kill them and you rid the streets of the animals. This you can do for me, senor. And for my son, who is dead.
The behind-the-scenes story of 1961's The Young Savages is the story of a former high school teacher turned prolific novelist and screenwriter. The real-life stories of inner-city youth gang violence that simultaneously fascinated and horrified the American public of the 1950s. A Hollywood screen legend who had to take an acting job at far less than his usual acting price to get his production company out of debt. A director's return to Hollywood and the restart of a successful career, and the adaptation of a hit Broadway musical that would become a beloved film classic. Salvatore Albert Lombino was born on October 15, 1926, a native of New York and a veteran of World War II. His writings can be traced to his short stories written aboard a naval destroyer while serving in the Pacific Theater. At war's end, he attended and graduated from Hunter's College, where he majored in English and psychology with minors in dramatics and education. He was, in fact, one of the first wave of male students admitted to the public university after decades of being an exclusively women's college. While serving to establish his writing career, he took a job as a teacher at one of the 4 Bronx vocational schools. His experience working as a teacher at an inner-city high school would serve as the inspiration for one of his most famous and well-remembered works under a name that he legally adopted 2 years before the publication of that story. It was the novel Blackboard Jungle, published in 1954. The pen name adopted by the former Salvatore Lombino was Evan Hunter, his new last name taken from the college that he had graduated from. In fact, Evan Hunter was one of several pen names that Lombino used in order for his readers to know what genre of writing to expect. Besides crime fiction, Lombino worked in science fiction, with his first published story, Welcome Martians, having been published under his birth name. The novels written by Lombino as Evan Hunter were urban crime thrillers with juvenile delinquency being one of the subjects that Evan Hunter tackled. However, the name Ed McBain is probably his most well-known pseudonym for his crime novels, including his 87th Precinct Police procedural series, which served as the basis for the early 1960s NBC crime drama of the same name. Interestingly, it was under the Evan Hunter pen name that Lombino also found success as a writer for a variety of genres other than crime fiction in both film and TV, including works with Kirk Douglas and Alfred Hitchcock. Blackboard Jungle is the best remembered of the Evan Hunter juvenile crime works, as it would be adapted as a film in 1955. The film had the first on-screen use of a rock and roll song, Bill Haley and his Comets' cover of Sunny Day in the Night's Rock Around the Clock, which played over the opening credits. It was in Blackboard Jungle that the emerging popularity of rhythm and blues, rebranded by disc jockey Alan Freed under the slang colloquial term for, ironically, sex, rock and roll, that the music genre aimed at the growing post-war teenage market would be associated with street gang violence, referred to at the time as juvenile delinquency. while Lombino continued writing under the Ed McBain pseudonym for his 87th Precinct novels, as well as other crime fiction projects under the pen names of Richard Marston and Kurt Cannon. A story of real-life youth gang violence began grabbing national attention in the summer of 1957. On July 30, 1957, 15-year-old Michael Farmer and his friend, 16-year-old Roger McShane, went to a Highbridge Park, New York swimming pool to escape the evening summer heat. Unfortunately, 2 weeks prior, members of a predominantly Puerto Rican gang, the Egyptian Kings, had been chased out of the park by members of a predominantly Irish-American gang, the Jesters. Allied with another gang, the Dragons, the Egyptian Kings were waiting in the park that night to ambush any members or perceived members of the Jesters. There is some dispute as to whether or not Michael Farmer had actually been a member of the Jesters. The same held true for Roger McShane. His friends and family members had vehemently denied his involvement with the Jesters, while members of the Egyptian Kings and Dragons had stated that they had seen McShane with that gang and that he was a confirmed member. When the two allied gangs attacked, McShane, though injured, had been able to escape. Farmer, however, partially handicapped and unable to run, had been beaten and stabbed repeatedly. One member of the Egyptian Kings had later confessed in an interview that he stabbed Farmer, who had been a survivor of childhood polio, with a bread knife because he wanted to know how it felt. Farmer died that night of his wounds. When 7 members of the two gangs had been arrested, one of the leaders, Angel Luis Velez, had wrote a letter to a local Spanish-language newspaper threatening the New York Police Department if their members were prosecuted. McShane, after his recovery, had received daily death threats at school, warning him to keep quiet about the attack in order to prevent him from testifying. Life magazine ran a series of articles about the murder of what the press referred to as the death of the polio boy. Reports about the case, as well as editorials, were run daily in the New York area newspapers, while the United Press International and the Associated Press carried the story across the country, with cities as far away as San Francisco printing the story of the murder of Michael Farmer, while simultaneously reporting stories about local acts of teen gang rivalries. Echoing sentiments that would be played out more than 60 years later regarding acts of violence among youth, the 1950s media was inundated and obsessed with the subject of juvenile delinquency. Lombino, or Evan Hunter, as he was now legally named, having already made a name for himself as a noted crime author with experience with both real-life youth crime and writing about the subject within a fictional context, now had the basis for his next novel. A Matter of Conviction was published in 1959, and to make the story a work of fiction, Lombino/Hunter reversed the ethnicities of the gang members, as well as that of the victim. The character, based on Michael Farmer, who was a white teenager, partially handicapped by childhood polio, was now a Puerto Rican boy named Rafael Morez, who was now blind. The protagonist of the novel, however, was neither the murder victim nor his friends or family. The novel's main narrative focuses on the district attorney, assigned to prosecute the gang members responsible for the killing. One of the gang members turns out to be the son of his former girlfriend from his own youth, providing the story's main conflict. Drawing from his own experiences, Evan Hunter made the protagonist Hank Bell a World War II veteran. He even drew more from his own experiences. Like Lombino, the Hank Bell of the novel is an Italian-American, with the birth name Henry Bellini, taking on the anglicized last name of Bell as he achieved professional career success.
I'm proud of old Hank Bellini. Goodbye, Mr. Supreme Court Justice.
What's the matter, Mr. Bellini? You ashamed of being a wop?
When United Artists acquired the rights to A Matter of Conviction, an actor would be needed who could convincingly portray that conflicted nature. Enter screen legend Burt Lancaster. Burt Lancaster's recent acting effort for United Artists, 1960's Elmer Gantry, had been both a critical and financial success, earning a profit of more than $2 million upon its release and winning Academy Awards in the categories of Best Actor for Burt Lancaster himself, Best Supporting Actress Shirley Jones, and Best Screenplay based on material from another medium, Richard Brooks, who coincidentally had directed the screen adaptation of Evan Hunter's Blackboard Jungle. However, despite the success for Elmer Gantry, Lancaster's own production company, Hecht Hill Lancaster, had gotten itself into debt due to the less than stellar performances at the box office for some of the company's own independently produced projects. Lancaster's usual acting price was $750,000. Due to the debt incurred at Hecht Hill Lancaster, he had to do The Young Savages for $600,000 less. Lancaster was not happy, especially since he had just written High from Elmer Gantry. Tension on the set was evident from the start. In the movie, one of the boys Lancaster is assigned to prosecute is the son of his childhood sweetheart, played by Shelley Winters. In real life, Winters and Lancaster had indeed been lovers years before. Shelley Winters, who would make a career out of playing dysfunctional mothers, was in fact the replacement actress to play the role of Mary DePace. Lee Grant was the first to be cast in the role. However, as detailed in the biographical book on Lancaster, Against Type, Grant apparently hated working with Lancaster. However, the hiring of Lancaster's ex might not have been much of a better idea, insofar as having a harmonious working atmosphere. During one scene where Lancaster and Winters, in character, were having a discussion over her son, played by Stanley Christian, as well as his case, the two professionals ended up stepping out of character, bringing up old hurts from their failed relationship that occurred years before. When interviewed about the incident, Winters admitted that she didn't remember the exact details of the argument in front of the cast and crew. She simply remembered the yelling and screaming. Lancaster apparently didn't get along any better with director John Frankenheimer, who was making his return to film after 4 years in television. His previous film, 1957's The Young Stranger, was his film debut, a personally unpleasant experience, and working with Lancaster was his reminder as to why he didn't enjoy his first film experience. Incidentally, The Young Stranger was also a teen-themed movie, albeit one about a boy from a well-to-do family, alienated from his producer father, as opposed to any involvement in inner-city street gangs. The lead in that movie was future co-star of Hawaii Five-0, James MacArthur, the young officer who Jack Lord would always say to,
"Book him, Dana."
The star and the director clashed so much on set that Lancaster reportedly told Frankenheimer that he blew it, as far as possibly working together in the star's next project, the biographical, if highly fictionalized account of Robert Stroud, The Birdman of Alcatraz. However, when Lancaster viewed the final cut of The Young Savages, he realized the talent in Frankenheimer. When filming was underway for The Birdman of Alcatraz, Lancaster replaced the director he had hired with John Frankenheimer. Frankenheimer's composition style becomes evident early on in The Young Savages. The view of the attacking gang members within the glasses of the victim, the playing cards serving as outlines. All of these artistic flourishes would be utilized the next year in Frankenheimer's adaptation of Richard Condon's Cold War thriller, 1962's The Manchurian Candidate. Frankenheimer and screenwriters Edward Anhalt and J.P. Miller had a roundabout history in how they were hired for this project. Edward Anhalt had a very diverse career. As a screenwriter, he took the Academy Award twice, first in 1951 for Panic in the Streets, and a second time in 1965 for Beckett. He also wrote the screenplay for the Elvis Presley vehicle Girls, 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 one of several movies that the King personally loathed doing. a career trend that would continue throughout the 1960s for the rock and roll icon at the behest of his manager, Colonel Tom Parker. It was Edward Anhalt who suggested to producer Harold Heck that he consider Frankenheimer to direct, citing the latter's directorial work on the TV show Playhouse 90, which interestingly featured scripts by J.P. Miller. Miller would share screen credit for the adaptation of Evan Hunter's A Matter of Conviction into The Young Savages, even though both Miller and Anhalt never collaborated or even met while working on the scripts. John Frankenheimer had essentially brought in J.P. Miller, a writer he was already familiar with, due to their working together on television, to rewrite Anhalt's script, which of course itself was the adaptation of Hunter's novel. The changes that were made, as always, were dependent upon practical matters, such as the sets and locations that were available, as well as the actors available to play certain roles. One significant change, which appears to be arbitrary, is in the naming of the victim. In the book, his name is Rafael Morez. In the movie, the victim's name was changed.
You know the name of the boy you killed?
We never seen him before.
His name was Roberto Escalante. He was 15 years old.
Other changes, or at least expansion of certain characters, had to do with real-life events that were added to make the film script more timely and current. One aspect in particular that distinguishes, though not necessarily totally differentiates, A Matter of Conviction from The Young Savages is the description of one of the gang members, expanded upon for the film. In both the novel and the movie, Anthony Aposto seems to be inspired by a real-life gang member who would be involved in a tragedy that, like the Michael Farmer murder of 2 years before, captured national attention.
What, do you feel like a big man?
No, I feel like killing you, that's what I feel.
On the evening of August 29, 1959, members of a primarily Puerto Rican street gang, the Vampires, entered a Hell's Kitchen playground to fight or rumble with their rivals, a gang made up of primarily Irish-American teens called the Norsemen. According to members of the Vampires, the Norsemen had beaten up some Puerto Rican kids, much as the Jesters had allegedly done 2 years prior at Highbridge Park, where 15-year-old Michael Farmer had been murdered. The Vampires sought revenge on the Norsemen, who were a no-show. However, other teens, 14-year-old Sandy Lukens and 2 16-year-olds, Robert Young Jr. and Anthony Krzyzinski, were in the park. Since the Norsemen were Irish, the 3 white teens were the same as the Vampires' enemies. One of the leaders of the Vampires, by the name of Salvador Agron, had directed the Vampires to block all exits from the playground so that no gringos could leave. When it was over, Young and Krzyzinski were both dead, stabbed to death by Agron, assisted by another member of the Vampires, Tony Hernandez. Both assailants would be arrested shortly after the incident, and it is said that Agron, who incidentally, like his victims, was only 16 years old, had worn a red-lined black nurse's cape to the fight, living up to the name of the Vampires. Witnesses who saw Agron and the rest of the gang flee the scene in a cab referred to Agron as the Capeman, and the press jumped onto the story of the murder and his arrest with sensationalized headlines and even illustrations of Agron, supposedly as a sort of teenaged Dracula figure. As mentioned in Hunter's novel, the character of Anthony Aposto is given a somewhat nodding reference to Agron, who, just prior to the book's late 1959 publication, had grabbed national attention. When The Young Savages was adapted from A Matter of Conviction, the character of Anthony Aposto, played on screen by actor Neil Burston, was given even more attributes based upon the real-life Salvador Agron that, though present in Hunter's novel, weren't quite as pronounced. Burston's character was given a cape, which he wears in the opening scene, much as the real-life Agron had worn at the time of the murder of Young and Krzyzinski, while also retaining the nickname written in Hunter's novel that somewhat evoked the Dracula alias that the newspapers gave to Salvador Agron.
The Batman?
Well, everybody calls me Batman.
The naming and referencing of that comic book icon years before William Dozier's campy 1960s TV version, and how Burstyn's Aposto character is inspired to commit acts of violence by looking at pictures of comic books, has shades of Frederick Rhythm's Seduction of the Innocent, a book that heavily influenced the 1954 Senate Subcommittee's investigation into juvenile delinquency. The book and the allegations nearly destroyed the comic book industry in the process. As far as can be surmised, National Publications, now known as DC Comics, never received any royalties for the use of the name Batman in The Young Savages. Like the relationship between the murder victim in the fictional story and the real-life Michael Farmer, the ethnicity of Neil Burstyn's Anthony Aposto character and the real-life Salvador Agron were switched, which some critical viewers found to be disingenuous, since the swapping of the victims and the accused, respective ethnic backgrounds, appeared to be pushing an overtly liberal political agenda. Actually, heated political debates over juvenile delinquency were regular occurrences in the media of the supposedly carefree and simple 1950s, as we tend to look back upon that time today. Other changes from book to movie included the character Lieutenant Gunnison. In the novel, the lieutenant and Hank Bell are only casually acquainted with each other, maintaining a distant but professional relationship, whereas in the movie, they are close friends. Also in the novel, Gunnison is described as tall, thin, with stringy blonde hair. On screen, however, the character was portrayed by the essentially hairless Telly Savalas, the future star of Kojak. The daughter of Hank Bell, played by teen idol Roberta Shore, is essentially played down in the movie, which is a strange choice, considering that she had made a name for herself in Blue Denim from 1959 and in Dick Clark's movie Because They're Young from the previous year, 1960. In the novel, her character is a point of contrast for Hank Bell as he contemplates how his daughter is different from the other teens that he is both prosecuting and learning about, but how she could have, theoretically, turned out just like them. Another teen idol of sorts appearing in The Young Savages is ingenue Jodie Fair. Born in 1934 and actually hailing from New York, she does a very convincing job as Angie, the tough-talking but ultimately sensitive girlfriend of Stanley Christian. Incidentally, The Young Savages is a contrast from her usual roles, such as 1958's Hot Rod Gang and 1959's The Ghost of Dragstrip Hollow. Hot Rod Gang, despite the use of the word gang, is actually a clean teen movie, and these were usually the types of roles that Jodie Fair participated in. The Young Savages shows her range as a gifted actress. The character of Louisa, a young prostitute in both the novel and movie, and completely unrelated to Rafael Morez, for whom she engages in a sexual relationship with, was changed to being the sister of Roberto Escalante. Louisa was played on screen by Filipino-American actress Pilar Ciorat, a working actress who played a variety of ethnic roles throughout the 1960s, on TV shows such as The Wild Wild West and Hawaii Five-0. She also co-starred with real-life World War II hero Audie Murphy in The Battle of Bloody Beach. Incidentally, the late actress was the mother of Hollywood producer Dean Devlin, known today for the successful science fiction blockbuster Independence Day, as well as the not-so-successful and even hated by genre fans Godzilla. That is, the 1998 version. Uncredited Chris Robinson portrayed gang leader Pretty Boy Savarese. In the book, that character is described as Big Dom Savarese, an intentionally ironic name since in the novel he is short. At over 6 feet in height, Chris Robinson would be hard-pressed to be described as short, so his point of insecurity was changed from his height to facial scars, hence the ironic name Pretty Boy. Robinson would be typecast as a teen delinquent type, at least for this phase of his career. In 1960's Because They're Young, which featured the film debut of Dick Clark, Robinson had played another teen gang leader, opposite Michael Callan, who had originated the role of Riff in the 1957 stage play version of West Side Story. Both Robinson and Callan would co-star together again in 1962's 13 West Street, which, like The Young Savages, dealt with youth crime, and just like The Young Savages, was told from the perspective of the adults. 13 West Street starred Alan Ladd, the star of the iconic western Shane, which also featured Brandon DeWilde, who was the star of Blue Denim. Blue Denim had in a supporting role Roberta Shore, who was also, as previously mentioned, in The Young Savages. There were several other veterans of the 1950s and 60s teen culture and movie scene that participated in The Young Savages. Mario Rocuzzo, who had penned Eddie Cochran's lament to teenage angst and neurosis, Nervous Breakdown, threatens Dina Merrill's Karen Bell character as Diavolo. Rocuzzo would play a delinquent again in 1964's The New Interns, which, again, starred Michael Callan, the co-star of Because They're Young and 13 West Street, with Chris Robinson, the previously mentioned gang leader of the Thunderbirds, here in The Young Savages. Accompanying Rocuzzo on the scare visit upon Dina Merrill is Robert P. Heller as Turtleneck, who would also play a small role in 13 West Street. Stanley Adams, who Star Trek fans will remember as the space station salesman Cyrano Jones in The Trouble with Tribbles, plays the sarcastic Lieutenant Hardy, who both aggravates and aids Burt Lancaster's Hank Bell character. He would return to teen films the following year with fellow The Young Savages alumni Chris Robinson in 1962's 13 West Street, as a competent but doomed private investigator hired by Alan Ladd. The head of the district attorney's office, for whom Burt Lancaster's Hank Bell is working for, was played by character actor Edward Andrews, who had also played John Saxon's mentally disturbed and violent father in 1956's The Unguarded Moment, which, like Evan Hunter's Blackboard Jungle and A Matter of Conviction / The Young Savages, featured a dedicated adult dealing with teenage delinquency. In that movie, however, it was Esther Williams in her first non-swimming role. West Side Story is mentioned in passing here, but the relationship between that movie adaptation of the hit play and The Young Savages will be explored in a bit. Dina Merrill's character was expanded upon from the book. In Evan Hunter's novel, she is a war bride, a German-born wife that Hank Bell meets while he served in Europe during World War II. In The Young Savages, Hank Bell's service in the war is unmentioned nor explored, and his wife Karen is no longer a German war bride but American-born, college-educated, upper-middle class, and with a left-leaning political outlook.
3,000 more votes. All you gotta do is electrocute a few kids.
You third-generation progressive, sitting up at Vassar getting your fat checks from Daddy? When was the last time you had a scrounge for a buck? You think I can afford this phony idealism of yours? I've got a job to do. Now get in that car.
As shown in these scenes, their differing views of social issues and politics provides another source of conflict in The Young Savages that does not exist in Evan Hunter's book. Dina Merrill, herself a real-life heiress and of the upper class like the character she plays in the film, actually had her own conflicts with director John Frankenheimer. The director is alleged to have referred to her as the worst actress ever, and she is reported to have cried as a result of his alleged verbal abuse on set. If true, this would be just one more on-set conflict between the stars and the director, as well as each other. Curiously, one conflict that did not happen on set was between two rival real-life gangs who'd been hired as extras for the film. The Puerto Rican Viceroys and the Italian-American East Harlem Red Wings. There are no reported incidents of those two rival gangs having carried out their rivalries on set. However, they had been in the newspapers prior to filming due to their real-life battles with each other over turf. On set, however, they conducted themselves with more professionalism than either the director or the stars. Recruited through a gang outreach program, they considered the set to be neutral territory, and they kept their rivalry in check. Which brings us to another subject, the other movie released by United Artists later in 1961 that dealt with the subject of juvenile delinquency, albeit with a much more stylized approach. The Young Savages was in fact a test by United Artists to see how mainstream audiences would react to the subject of juvenile delinquency on screen, as UA prepared to release its 1961 screen adaptation of the 1957 Broadway hit musical West Side Story. There had been many movies, numbering literally in the hundreds, that dealt with juvenile delinquency prior to 1961. However, after the 1955 releases to mainstream theaters of both Blackboard Jungle, again itself a screen adaptation of another Evan Hunter novel, and Rebel Without a Cause, which co-starred the late James Dean and Natalie Wood, slated to star again in West Side Story. These later post-Rebel Without a Cause juvenile delinquent movies that were rushed into production were primarily low-budgeted drive-in movie fare, usually no more than 90 minutes or less in runtime, and often double-billed with either an equally low-budgeted horror or science fiction movie aimed at teen audiences who usually didn't even pay attention to what was happening on screen. West Side Story would be a big-budget, mainstream theatrical movie release that dealt with the subject of youth gangs, distinct from exploitive JD movies such as High School Caesar or Riot in Juvenile Prison, both from 1959, or 1958's High School Confidential, ironically starring Russ Tamblyn, who would co-star in the movie adaptation of West Side Story, taking over the role played on stage by Michael Callan, who, as previously mentioned, was Chris Robinson's co-star in the previously years Because They're Young, as well as 1962's 13 West Street, and of course Chris Robinson was in The Young Savages. United Artists wanted to be sure of their investment. Hence, The Young Savages would be the first mainstream movie to be shown at major theaters, dealing with juvenile delinquency in the 6 years since the release of Rebel Without a Cause. Because both The Young Savages and West Side Story dealt with the same subject matter, the rivalry of white and Puerto Rican youth gangs, with The Young Savages being a lead-up to West Side Story, another change from Evan Hunter's book was added to the film. A song.
My mother sells snow to the snowbirds. My father makes barbershop gin. My sister sells jazz for a living. And that's why the money rolls in.
Curiously, both The Young Savages and West Side Story, two films that dealt with an aspect of 1950s and early 60s youth culture, both avoided the use of a rock and roll background soundtrack. Jazz legend and Beat Generation figure David Amram supplied the soundtrack and incidental music for The Young Savages, which has liberal doses of jazz and Latin rhythms, but no ersatz instrumental rock music, which was typical in movies and TV shows made during this time that dealt with the subject of juvenile delinquency. If there is one aspect of JD or juvenile delinquent dramas that The Young Savages shares with other similarly themed films, at least the more well-meaning and less exploitive examples of this genre, it is the film's look. The themes expressed in the art direction, combined with the use of black and white cinematography to convey a sense of danger and foreboding, a trope inherited from the JD drama's film noir pedigree and shared in movies such as Reginald Rose's Crime in the Streets, Irving Shulman's Cry Tough, Robert Presnell's adaptation of Willard Motley's Let No Man Write My Epitaph, as well as the previously mentioned work by Evan Hunter, Blackboard Jungle, and even in the J.D. spoof by Jerry Lewis, The Delicate Delinquent. However, The Young Savages stands out from others in its genre, even from those similar films with well-meaning intentions, due to the filmmaker's sincere efforts at authenticity, eschewing in-studio film sets that supposedly recreate inner-city locales for actual, on-location shooting in New York. It is this level of care and attention to detail that separates The Young Savages from the more exploitive juvenile delinquent themed movies from the same time. Director of cinematography, San Francisco-born Lionel Linden deserves much of the credit for the creative and artistic film shots on the film, every bit as much as director John Frankenheimer. An Academy Award winner in his own right, Lionel Linden is best remembered for his work on Around the World in 80 Days. Linden's fine cinematography was also utilized to dramatic effect in George Pal's Conquest of Space, Willis O'Brien's stop-motion thriller The Black Scorpion, Robert Wise's 1958 biography of Barbara Graham, I Wanna Live, and Frankenheimer's project the following year after The Young Savages, The Manchurian Candidate. He would continue to lend his expertise behind the camera until his passing on September 20, 1971 in Van Nuys, Los Angeles. The art direction gave The Young Savages its bleak, urban jungle look. That came courtesy of TV veteran Nathaniel Schmid, listed on the opening credits as Burr Schmid. A few months after the release of The Young Savages, Schmid would be nominated for a Primetime Emmy in the category of Outstanding Achievement in Art Direction and Scenic Design for his work on the CBS TV adaptation of Graham Greene's novel, The Power and the Glory, starring Laurence Olivier, which aired on October 29, 1961, a little over a week after the theatrical release of West Side Story. Schmid was in good company with other fellow TV veterans who lent their own expertise towards giving The Young Savages its art direction. James Crow, who worked on the set design, would later go on to work on Gilligan's Island, Bewitched, and The Farmer's Daughter, and who previously cut his teeth in crime films such as 1959's interracial love story noir The Crimson Kimono. James Crow's on-location set design gives The Young Savages the feel of an inner-city war zone, complete with a wrecking ball, as foreshadowing in the opening sequence. Crow's set design is a concrete jungle, which is very much in keeping with the popular media perception and concerns of that time. This look and feel of the then contemporary environment that bred 1950s and early 1960s gang life and juvenile delinquency is either largely forgotten or deliberately taken out of the current narrative for the 50s in favor of the supposedly feel-good and quaint 1950s nostalgia with its condescendingly artificial, clean, bright colors and cutesy look, and deliberately laughable image of the greaser, a sharp contrast to the actual 1950s and early 1960s bopping or gang-fighting juvenile delinquent. Crow evidently also paid attention to the extras as the graffiti of real-life youth gangs, such as the Viceroys, can be clearly seen on the brick walls of the alleys that John Davis Chandler, Stanley Christian, and Neil Burston walk through as they, in their roles as members of the Thunderbirds gang, march ominously into rival Horseman gang turf to commit their acts of violence against the blind Roberto Escalante. Ada Warren, who would go on to work extensively on Rod Serling's classic science fiction anthology series The Twilight Zone, edited The Young Savages with a brisk pace that was just fast enough to keep viewers on the edges of their seats as they, along with Lancaster's Hank Bell, uncover the various layers to the stories and backgrounds of the participants in the movie's narrative without making the film feel rushed. Sidney Pollack, the future award-winning director of the classics The Way We Were, The Electric Horseman, and many others, as well as the cult martial arts gangster film The Yakuza, served as the uncredited dialogue coach on The Young Savages. He was one of the crew members who was actually present and who had to deal with stars Burt Lancaster and Shelley Winters' tirades against each other on set. Obviously, he went on to a more high-profile career as a celebrated director before his passing from cancer in May of 2008. Costumes on The Young Savages came courtesy of two film veterans. Roselle Novello, whose previous work included Hitchcock's thriller Vertigo and the Jimmy Stewart classic Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and Jack Angel. His fine talents were relegated primarily to lower-budgeted B-movies, whose work with Novello lends a touch of authenticity to The Young Savages. Well, mostly lends a touch of authenticity. According to interviews with former street gang members from the late 1950s and early 1960s of New York, the stingy brim hats and overcoats worn by the horsemen in the funeral procession is indeed authentic and previously unseen in any other 1950s or early 1960s JD movies, at least in that combination. However, the leather jacket and rolled jeans with motorcycle boots look, made popular in 1953's The Wild One and 1955's Rebel Without a Cause, was, according to interviews, no longer worn by New York teen gang members in 1960 or 61, which would explain the look's absence in that year's West Side Story. Most likely, this costume choice was the result of meeting mainstream audiences' stereotypes as to how supposed juvenile delinquents dressed. The irony was that after Rebel Without a Cause, even upper-middle-class suburban teens who had no connection with youth gangs whatsoever often dressed in this fashion as a fad and an outward sign of mild rebelliousness that had little, if anything, to do with the real-life youth gang violence that existed in the inner city during the same time. That appropriation of perceived gang styles by upper-class teens during the 1950s brings us back to the subject of the current nostalgic image of that time. It was that mainstream appropriation of perceived gang styles which helped to justify the erasing of real-life 50s youth gang violence from collective memory, decades later, with the perception of perceived 50s gang styles as originating from a supposedly carefree and harmless source. The irony is that this sanitized version of 50s youth gang history actually begun during the 50s nostalgia fad of the 1970s as a reaction to the tragedies of Vietnam, Kent State, and other late 1960s cultural upheavals, unintentionally makes the 50s and early 60s, in actuality an important time in American history in its own right, seem unrelatable and even trivial to many of today's seriously minded mainstream young. Teens and college-age students who are into studying about vintage culture such as swing dancing and rockabilly being the exceptions, of course. The Young Savages, of course, concerned itself with issues that were in the public consciousness regarding the teenagers of its own time period. This was reflected in the publicized casting of real gang members as participants, both on film and in promotional tours. Luis Arroyo, Stanley Christian, and Richard Velez had been billed by the United Artists Publicity Department as former juvenile delinquents, who theater patrons attending screenings during publicity tours can meet in the lobby. One such tour occurred on May 24, 1961, at San Francisco's Lowe's Theater on Market Street, another inner city, of course, which had its own youth gang subculture, with reports of local gang violence also making headlines, often in the very same newspapers that advertised the publicity tours for The Young Savages. It was this sort of background that cities like San Francisco, along with Los Angeles and Chicago, that made these particular markets lucrative and the target of United Artists' publicity campaign when promoting The Young Savages. And of course, it was this target marketing that, once perfected, would be repeated later in 1961 for UA's West Side Story. If the casting of former gang members Arroyo, Christian, and Velez in key roles gave The Young Savages its sense of authenticity, it also provided United Artists with its major selling point as the young actors went on tour to promote the film. The three ex-gang members had actually came out of a New York gang outreach and community theater program, the Centurions, run by minister and playwright Ben Moring. Ben Moring's Centurions program was a then unique approach to gang outreach. Like the more well-remembered program from fellow minister David Wilkerson of the Cross and the Switchblade fame, Moring combined religious teachings with drug rehabilitation programs. However, Moring, a military veteran, martial arts instructor, and aspiring playwright, utilized those three disciplines to give the teen participants of his program not only structure, as well as athletic outlets for their youthful and sometimes aggressive energy, but also an artistic outlet. Moring's self-penned stage plays cast members of the aforementioned Viceroys, as well as members of the Sportsmen, Forsyth Street Boys, and Red Wings gangs in roles such as Moring's own off-Broadway production of Out of the Box to bring attention to the general public about inner-city concerns regarding poverty, drug addiction, street crime, and gang violence. These, of course, were the same subjects that Frankenheimer and Lancaster were about to tackle for a wider audience on film, and it would seem that the association between the filmmakers and the local New York gang outreach program would be mutually beneficial. It would be the focus for United Artists' marketing campaign for their new socially conscious film, and for Moring, the participation of members of his Centurions would prove the validity of his program, which of course could help it to grow with funding. At least the program's success in rehabilitating youth seemed to be valid during the course of the film's initial run. And so, in addition to the three young supporting actors, even more members of the Centurions were recruited, providing Frankenheimer with enough former and even current gang members in supporting and minor roles, giving UA's claim of authenticity even more validity. However, one Centurion, who even went on tour to promote the film, Ramon Ortiz, would later gain additional, if unwanted, publicity for actions that reflected issues addressed in The Young Savages. According to United Artists, Ortiz had been paid $300 while working as an extra when shooting exteriors were done near his neighborhood. He'd also been paid $500 a week for participating in a 2-week publicity tour for promotion of the film. Apparently, his work on the movie, a non-speaking role, as well as his participation in the publicity tour, earned him a measure of respect among his peers, as well as the nickname of the Actor, for which he had now become known in his neighborhood. Unfortunately, shortly after the tour ended, Ortiz fell back into old habits. He was convicted of burglary in Nassau County and given a 3-year suspended sentence. Then, 5 years later, on August 2, 1965, Ortiz was arrested and charged for stabbing 16-year-old Walter Cordero in a gang fight involving a dozen or so local teens and young adults in his neighborhood. 25-year-old John Morales was also hospitalized in critical condition for gunshot wounds, while 3 others were treated for injuries. This real-life example of gang violence, committed by a one-time member of the cast of The Young Savages, was not unlike the fictional portrayal of gang violence featured in the movie, with revenge for an alleged previous beating by Italian gang members upon Puerto Rican gang rivals being the reported motivation for this fight. And one of history's great ironies, the incident involving Ramon Ortiz occurred on Sunday, August 1st, 1965, the same night that The Young Savages would air on WABC TV. The Young Savages was released on May 24th, 1961, 5 months before the film version of West Side Story. It did reasonably well in inner-city markets, but not quite as well in more regional markets, which should come as no surprise considering the subject matter. It's primarily remembered today as West Side Story without the singing and dancing, but it is much more than that. The movie captures and reflects the social and political issues of the time that it was made. It also manages to capture the real aesthetics of 1950s and early 1960s gang life with authenticity that was often lacking in other movies on youth gangs made around the same time. The Young Savages also had a legacy of sorts, expressed through an NBC made-for-TV movie event broadcast nearly 20 years after The Young Savages was released. The story of Salvador Agron, expanded upon specifically for the film, was portrayed in a 1980 NBC TV movie event starring Colleen Dewhurst and David Labiosa in the fictionalized Agron role. Like The Young Savages, it is a courtroom drama. Titled Death Penalty, the 1980 broadcast did handle certain scenes and situations in a more believable manner than its 1961 predecessor. Take, for example, these two scenes, one from The Young Savages and compared with one from Death Penalty.
And not a single trace of blood.
No, I wiped it clean. And
Nobody could wipe it that clean. Nobody could wipe it so clean that the police lab wouldn't find a single trace of blood on it. No, Danny, you never stabbed him at all. You only pretended to stab him.
No,
You turned the handle of the blade around and you stabbed him here on the shoulder.
No, I stabbed him.
You're lying, Danny. Danny, what are you afraid of?
You talked to the district attorney, didn't you?
Me?
Yes, didn't you talk to the district attorney after you were indicted?
Yes.
Yes. Now, you and Carlos were indicted together, isn't that true?
Yeah.
But then you talked to the district attorney, and your trial was severed. Now, did anybody promise you anything?
No.
Nobody promised you anything. Nobody told you that your case would be separated and that they would go easy on you if you became a state's witness?
No.
Or perhaps that you would be held in a detention center, and then when your trial did come up, that you would be sentenced only to time served and then released? Now, isn't that what happened?
It didn't happen. It didn't.
But your case was separated, wasn't it, after you talked to the district attorney?
Yes.
There never was any plan for wasting everybody and anybody in sight, was there?
The setup of a prosecutor actually saying an accused did not have motivation of premeditated murder, and the accused saying that he did, seems odd at best. The exposing of a plea deal by the defense and death penalty rather than Lancaster's career-risking DA as defense attorney makes more sense. Still, death penalty does reference its predecessor in one scene.
Unable to cope with these young savages to stop the tidal wave that threatens to drown us all.
2 decades later, the influence of the Young Savages was still being felt, as evidenced in these 2 clips. As for the careers of the stars of the Young Savages following the film's initial 1961 theatrical run, Burt Lancaster, a Hollywood legend of course, and a box office draw throughout his career, went on to star in many more classics and even a beloved 1986 comedy with friend and fellow legend Kirk Douglas before his passing on October 20, 1994. Dina Merrill would continue to be a working actress. She would later serve on the board of trustees of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, as well as a vice president of the New York City Mission Society. She was a member of the board of trustees of E.F. Hutton Company, a major corporation that was also a family business. She passed away in 2017. For better or for worse, Shelley Winters ended up making a career of playing dysfunctional mothers before her passing in 2006. She even parodied that bit of typecasting in a 2-part episode of the 1960s Batman TV series. Incidentally, co-star Dina Merrill had also guest starred in Batman with her then-husband, Cliff Robertson. As for the young co-stars, Jodie Fair, a perennial favorite of teen films in the 1950s, such as the aforementioned Hot Rod Gang, that same year's High School Confidential, and 1959's The Ghost of Dragstrip Hollow, she, along with Chris Robinson, would go on to do westerns on TV in the 1960s. She retired from the film business to focus on real estate, while Chris Robinson, after having a brief run-in with the IRS in the 1980s, continues to act to this day. Roberta Shore had started with Disney, and she would continue to do Disney movies as well as westerns before retiring from the film industry. Stanley Christian would only go on to do a few more TV appearances before retiring, while John Davis Chandler the psychopathic Reardon in the Young Savages would make a career out of a variety of character roles, including westerns with Sam Peckinpah. Tragically, Neil Burston, also known as Neil Nephew, who played the Anthony Batman Aposto character, committed suicide in 1978. Though he had continued to act well into the 1970s, he, according to former wife Ellen Burston, had been struggling with schizophrenia and depression, mental health issues that, ironically, the characters in the Young Savages also struggled with. As for John Frankenheimer and Evan Hunter, their names would be forever linked to films that today are regarded as true classics. The Young Savages is remembered by fans of noir and teen films as a classic. The Young Savages was a sincere effort on the part of screenwriters Ann Holt, Miller, and novelist Salvador Lombino, aka Evan Hunter, to address the social and political issues of their time. These were issues of youth crime, mental health, poverty, racism, and politics. What makes The Young Savages still relevant today, decades after its 1961 release, is that those are issues that we still struggle with today. I hope you enjoyed this mini documentary. If you're interested in the history of the youth culture presented in this retrospective, I also have a blog, really written as an expansive book, and details the history of 1950s and early 1960s youth gangs. The link is in the description of this video. And if you like the work that I'm doing, the research into the true history of 1950s youth culture, consider becoming a Patreon patron. Patrons will receive exclusive updates, and of course, your support helps me to continue doing this work as more complex, interesting, and entertaining documentaries on 1950s youth culture will be in the works. Thank you, and stay tuned for more.